The four beings felt the passage of the soul at the moment of her death and stomped their hooved feet impatiently from being so close to claiming their prize. They motioned for the girl to be collected from inside the building, and they waited. 3 of the disfigured warriors cautiously approached the front door and entered the darkness. The moments dragged on and felt like an eternity to all who stood before the old mill, and the 4 horsemen continued to wait. They waited. With the sound of air being sucked into a vacuum, a loud swish of wind erupted suddenly. The door blew off its hinges from a massive fireball. The entire front of the mill caught aflame and collapsed from the impact of the explosion. Then all was deathly silent. The old mill was obscured by rising thick smoke billowing and swirling into the sky. After what felt like an eternity, something emerged from the haze. Slowly, a small lone figure walked into view out of the rubble. Tabitha stood alone, with eyes transfixed on the 4 entities.
Take her, and let us be done with this matter. The sooner the Father of the Sky and the Son of Fire take hold of their prize, the sooner the day of Armageddon will be upon us.
A cold, hateful smile emerged on each of the 4 beings' faces as they spoke with a breath of lust.
Bring us the body of the witch. Opportunity may still linger in our favor, for if warmth remains within her flesh, her soul is still within our grasp. We will pierce the membrane between here and the afterlife, and take hold of her spirit.
3 of the horsemen's warriors approached the little girl as she continued her slow walk out of the debris. Her gaze remained transfixed and unbroken upon the 4 beings, and she took no notice of the approaching creatures. The horsemen's servants looked at each other uncertainly. Something was wrong. Something was not right. There was no fear in the child's face. There was no hesitation in her forward pace. In the last moments of their life, they realized there was no humanity left in the girl's eyes. Tabitha suddenly raised her hands and clutched her fingers toward the sky. Thorny roots erupted from the ground and below the surprised beasts. The vines wrapped themselves around the creatures and pierced their skin, entangling themselves around bone and tissue. More and more roots burst through the ground, and tighter their grip became. With hands still held above her head, Tabitha slammed them down into the ground, and the 3 creatures exploded from being torn apart by the thorned vines. Fear spread and consumed the army that stood before her, and they turned to flee. They scrambled and trampled each other to escape, for they saw and understood what approached. Tabitha looked to her left, then to her right, and finally center. A wall of earth and stone rose from the ground and blocked all who attempted to retreat. Electricity from her palms branched out and incinerated those closest to her. She looked up to the sky and spoke the forbidden words of Wormwood, and hail of fire fell upon her enemies. She then spoke the prayer of desecration, and globulous worms with translucent skin emerged from the soil. Slow and awkward of movement they were, but their numbers quickly overwhelmed the army of the horsemen. Their large and bulbous bodies fell upon the creatures, and they consumed and devoured their prey alive. Muffled screams of agony and torment could be heard from within the guts of the disgusting worms as they slowly sunk back into the earth. The only hint of their presence was the wet ground, still saturated with their slime and saliva. Tabitha stood before the 4 horsemen without trepidation or fear. The horsemen reared back, each brandishing a weapon, a sword, a spear, a whip of razors, and a black sickle. Electricity filled the air and whipped to and fro between the small child and her 4 adversaries. She looked up and met each one's gaze. She smiled and said, "Would you like to play a game with me?" The horsemen flew into a fury of rage, cursing and swearing at the little girl in her demonic tongue. Unfazed by the show of violence and anger, Tabitha repeated, "Would you like to play a game with me?" Each horseman shot up into the air. Invisible hands broke the bones in their arms and legs. The four beings remained suspended and restrained for a moment as Tabitha circled them and admired her work. They screamed in pain and terror as the little girl twirled them in the air for her pleasure, and she skipped underneath the shower of their bleeding bodies as if it were a springtime rain. Tabitha danced and danced under the drizzle of blood. She danced to contain the rage. She danced to hide from the sorrow of loss. She danced until she could no longer dance. Tabitha stopped and closed her eyes and screamed into the night sky. Her voice crossed the land for miles and miles, shattering rocks and splintering trees. She stood there motionless for a bit, then rose her head toward her captives and asked again, "Would you like to play a game with me? I think you'll like it. I just made it up, just right now, just for you," she laughed. Tabitha raised 4 of her fingers and said, "This little horsey didn't play well with others and made everyone fight," and the girl lowered one of her fingers. The first horseman screamed in pain as his head was plucked from his body like a grape pulled from the stem. "This little horsey coughed and made everyone sick." She lowered her second finger. The second horseman opened his mouth wide to scream. The flesh in his face stretched further and further until it rolled back on itself over his head and down his neck. The skin continued to peel all the way down his body until it reached the hooves of its legs. Tabitha turned to face the third horseman. She lowered her third finger and said, "This little horsey's stomach growled and made all the people so very hungry." The horseman let out a gurgling yell of agony and pain. Blood and intestines shot high into the sky as the horseman's stomach violently exploded. Tabitha looked upon the final horseman and whispered, "And this little horsey died and fell down, 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 all the way to hell." She lowered her last finger, and each of the horseman's arms and legs were pulled from its body. The head of the horseman twisted slowly around, and the snaps of its spine elicited screams of pain from the once mighty being. The body parts separated and tore free from the bloody torso and were tossed away like one would discard rubbish and trash. Tabitha stared at the corpses, and her smile of pleasure gradually faded. She fell to her knees and wept. She cried for the loss of innocence. Tabitha grieved for the loss of her mother. She cried until the morning sun peeked over the horizon and banished the stars from the sky overhead. Tabitha cried until exhaustion overcame her, and she surrendered to the numbness of sleep. Darkness. Darkness permeated the air as far as the eye could see with an oppressive weight. It dominated everything, except for a small area of illumination. A bright sphere of light floated above 2 intruders to the darkness. Deep within the cavern, Tabitha walked with her hand held tightly in Buddy's grasp. Occasionally she would look down at the red lines that glowed from her forearm and point at the direction they must go. It was the 3rd day within the caves, and it was slow going. Buddy was still weak and hadn't fully recovered from his wounds. The demon's injuries were severe, but his kind was resilient and healed quickly. For any other traveler, the journey into the caverns would have been hard and nearly impossible, but for Tabitha, it was the equivalent to a hike through the woods. Her ball of light shined brightly, giving them light and warmth. She slept 6 inches high and over the cold stone floor as she levitated comfortably from above. Incantations of fertility produced an abundance of sweet and delicious berries and fruits for her and Buddy to share. And of course, she had Buddy to keep her company and drive away the loneliness. On the third day, they entered into a chasm with a great ravine where the ceiling of the cave could no longer be seen. The further they walked, the darkness was slowly replaced with a soft purple glow of light. Soon they stood before the 3 obelisks. Past the 3 towers, a crowd of women, young and old, gathered to greet the duo. The group parted, allowing an elderly woman dressed in white garments to pass. She had a welcoming smile, and her arms were open wide, beckoning them to come forward. With her hand still held tightly in Buddy's grip, Tabitha looked up into the darkness and whispered, "I did it. I did it just as you asked. I love you, Mommy."
In the faraway places where gods are born and worlds are created, ancient gears turned and fell into place. Old keys turned, opening locks to lost and forgotten places. The reverberance of change rippled across the fabric of time and space. It was so small, but as it expanded, the wave became more turbulent and massive. It traveled across the great expanse of space, gaining force and momentum, until it penetrated the barrier separating the world of the flesh from those ancient places where the celestial beings dwelt. Across infinite universes and within countless heavenly throne rooms, cries from every god could be heard. Within all pits of damnation and punishment, screams of terror escaped the lips of every king and queen of hell. A new day had arrived, a day in which the daughters of the mother would rise and retake their lost and stolen birthright. The rulers of heaven and the conquerors of hell trembled in fear, for they had been stripped of their omniscience. Only the here and now were they permitted to see. In her wisdom, and with a final act of revenge, the mother only allowed one single future event to be perceived. Only one day predestined to come would dominate their thoughts. It was one simple word of warning to reveal what approached from the distance. A word that was all they were permitted to see. This word was given to them to obsess over before the coming of the child of prophecy. The word on their lips was war.